Ever find yourself, really thinking about how California came to be, like the California we know?
It's easy to picture the gold rush, Hollywood, all that. But where did it all begin? This deep dive, we're going to totally change how you see California.
We're talking about a legacy, a
Oh.
huge one that most people don't even know about.
We're diving into The Chinese-Made California by Piero Scaruffi.
Oh, absolutely.
And I gotta say, just skimming it, my mind was blown. Are you ready to unearth some history here?
Yeah. Get ready for a total perspective shift because we're going to uncover this whole layer of history. It's huge for understanding California, but it's rarely ever talked about.
Right, like before we even get into the details, paint us a picture. What was California like before the gold rush, before the wave of Chinese immigrants came?
So you might be surprised to hear that back then, California,
Hmm.
it was basically a blank canvas. I'm talking wide open, very little development.
Oh.
Yeah. Spanish and Russian explorers had come through, but they didn't really change much. Even the gold rush, and you'd think that would, you know, really shaken things up, but even that mostly just led to a bunch of boom towns popping up.
Mm-hmm.
Not the California we know today.
Not even close.
Yeah.
Knowing what it becomes, that's almost hard to imagine.
Hmm.
So then the Chinese immigrants start arriving. Scaruffi, he doesn't hold back at all. He calls them like the engine of progress, which is a bold statement. What makes him so sure?
You know what, though? He's not exaggerating. This book digs into it,
Mhm.
and their influence is everywhere you look. Mining,
Yeah.
the railroads, even agriculture. Just take gold mining, for instance.
Sure.
The Chinese, they weren't just laborers. They had these incredible skills. They were extracting gold that everyone else had totally missed.
Wow.
And this wasn't just about them, striking it rich, which a lot of them did, but this flood of new wealth.
Yes.
It actually ended up funding a lot of the big infrastructure that would become key for California to develop.
So they were literally, digging up the resources to build the future. And not just for themselves, but for, everybody who came after.
Exactly. And speaking of building, you can't talk about this without talking about the railroads. Just think about it. The Chinese, they laid the tracks that physically connected California to the rest of the country.
Yeah.
That's massive, right?
Yeah.
But it's not just about, the physical connection, though.
Yeah.
It's also about all of the information and resources that all of a sudden could start flowing back and forth. Communication, trade, new ideas, spreading it. It changed everything.
It's like they show up trying to make a better life for themselves, and they end up building these pathways, these huge opportunities, not just for them, but for generations down the line. But their impact, it wasn't just limited to these massive projects, these industries, right?
Scaruffi also talks about agriculture.
Oh, yeah. And it's a fascinating part of the story. They brought all this knowledge with them. They knew about irrigation and farming techniques that completely changed the game. We're talking turning literal swamps into land that was super fertile.
Wow.
Think how that changed California's ability to feed a booming population.
Okay, so they're shaping, the land itself, the economy, how society's even working.
Yeah.
But then it gets even more interesting when you think about what they did for, building cities, right?
Because it seems kind of contradictory. They were facing all this discrimination, but then they end up playing this big role in California's cities growing up.
Exactly. It's kind of a sad irony, right?
Right.
They were often, forced into these segregated Chinatowns.
Right?
But then those very Chinatowns, they became the first stable urban centers.
Yeah.
They were the foundation for the cities that we know in California today.
Makes you realize, how complex history really is.
They're literally laying the groundwork for everything, but at the same time, they're up against these crazy obstacles.
It reminds you that progress, it's not always a straight line,
Yeah.
And for every big, sweeping story you hear, there are tons of individual stories, and a lot of them we just don't know about.
Speaking of which, the thing that really struck me in The Chinese-Made California, the way Scaruffi talks about all the really tough stuff these immigrants went through,
Yeah.
he does not sugarcoat it.
No, definitely not. He talks about the prejudice, all the laws that were against them, even just how dangerous the work was.
Yeah.
Really heavy stuff.
Absolutely. He's really upfront about the violence and how they were taken advantage of.
Right.
But you know what? Through all of it, they were unbelievably resilient.
It's amazing.
Think about it. They're contributing so much to this whole new world while dealing with stuff that's, unimaginable for most of us.
It makes you wonder, how could their story get pushed aside for so long? What are we missing when we don't, acknowledge those contributions? It's like we're missing a whole chapter, right? And not just any chapter, a really important one. And it's not just about the past either.
Yeah.
Scarufi, he makes this really interesting point about how the Chinese being there is connected to California's whole identity, like California being this big melting pot.
Oh, absolutely. He talks about that a lot, how San Francisco especially became super diverse way earlier than almost anywhere else in the U.S.
And he says the Chinese had a lot to do with that.
Exactly. He argues that California, it was born the most cosmopolitan state in the Union,
Right.
and that the Chinese really set the stage for that.
Which is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it, because, like, at the same time, they're facing all this discrimination.
Right.
It's like this weird double standard, they being pushed to the margins,
Yeah.
but just them being there is changing everything about society. It makes you think about all the ripple effects of history and how sometimes the biggest changes, they come from the most unexpected places.
Totally. It
Yeah.
just shows how much of history is about, like, these unintended consequences.
Yeah.
By 1880, a big chunk of the people working in agriculture in California were Chinese. It wasn't just one city or one industry. It was everywhere.
It's like this, invisible force,
Yeah.
shaping the California we know.
Totally.
So why do you think their story hasn't gotten the same attention as other big California stories?
But Scarufi, he thinks part of it was the language barrier, but also, like, a difference in cultures.
Okay.
He says there's no single, hero in this story, no equivalent of, I don't know, a Columbus or whoever that we always learn about in history books.
Right.
It's interesting because it makes you think about how we usually see history,
Like we look for this one person or this one big event,
Right.
and we miss the power of people working together, an entire community that changes a place.
And that's really what the Chinese-made California does so well.
It's like, hey, look beyond the stories you already know and think about all the contributions that usually don't get talked about.
It really makes you think, how do we even start to acknowledge that? To really honor those contributions, especially on such a massive scale.
It feels like we owe it to them to get this right, to show the whole picture.
It's a debt we can never really repay, right?
Right.
But even just recognizing it is huge. It starts with telling these stories, letting people hear these voices, and just understanding that California, like the California we know, it wouldn't even exist without them.
It's almost like you look around, right? And everything we think of when we think of California, all the innovation, the different cultures, the drive to build new stuff, it all goes back to this time, to the Chinese immigrants coming here.
That's why Scarufi's book is so powerful, I think.
Yeah.
He's saying, their legacy isn't just these buildings or the railroads or whatever. It's deeper than that. It's in the very DNA of California,
Wow.
The spirit of never giving up, of being open to different cultures, of always trying to create a better future. That all comes from this history, even if we don't always see it.
That actually gives me chills. It's like their story is a part of everything here, even in ways we don't realize.
It's everywhere.
And the thing is, we're just scratching the surface here. Scarufi's just one voice sharing one community's experience.
Right?
It makes you think, what other stories are out there? Stories we haven't heard that could totally change how we understand how we got here.
That's what's so cool about history, though. It's like this conversation that's always going. The more you dig, the more you question stuff, the more you learn, and your whole perspective changes.
Totally. It reminds me of that quote, I can't remember who said it, but it's like, history isn't just the past, it's the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history. So listener, next time you're out there, walking down a busy street or you're hiking in Yosemite, just take a second.
Yeah.
Think about all the people who came before, all those stories we haven't always heard, and how that legacy of never giving up, of building a better future, how that's still shaping California today.
And if you really want to have your mind blown, definitely check out The Chinese-Made California. It's a powerful book.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep diving deep.